Look, I firstly just want to start and say welcome to First Call, a funeral podcast. This is kind of an idea Bradley and I had, and welcome to the podcast. Welcome from Whakatane.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and we're streaming here live out of Terry Longley and Son Funeral Services here in Havelock North. And look, I just want to start by saying that, you know, this podcast won't be for everyone. And we acknowledge that for some that have experienced a loss recently may find this a little bit difficult. And so we're sensitive to that. Also just want to say we're not professional podcasters, and podcasting isn't new. There are funeral directors in overseas that have done this before, and we think due to the New Zealand culture and the way we do things differently that we can bring something to the conversation. So we decided to give this a go and put the information out there, and I think people are interested to hear what we've got to say, Brad.
Yeah, I think it's about giving people the opportunity to take control of the situation when someone dies, and it's understanding what the process is after that fact, after someone's passed away. And it's just giving people that insight, helping with maybe a change. You know, there's so many different changes when the time comes, and you know it's a terrible time for everybody. So we're going to cover off a few things along that front.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
We're also going to give some insight into, you know, how to land yourself a job in a funeral home.
Yeah, interesting point.
And you know, that's where it leads me really to our first point, which is getting a job in a funeral home. How did your journey start? I mean, where did you start?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating kind of story, really. And ever since I was born, really, Dad and Granddad were funeral directors. And so my whole life I kind of grew up kind of with funerals being second nature to our family. And
Sure.
Some of my earliest memories are down at the funeral home, watching Dad, watching Granddad, and just soaking it all in. You know, by the time I'd started school, my brother and I, as I said, funerals and dying was just a normality in our household. And to a lot of our friends, we became those funeral directors' sons, and the kids always wanted to know those curly questions. And to some extent, we could answer them.
I suppose they had a bit of an interest in what was happening
I suppose
outside of school.
6 and 7 year olds having that kind of interest, yeah.
For sure.
And, you know, most of my days after school, I'd actually walk down to the funeral home, and I still remember, you know, playing with the photocopier and folding hymn sheets for the funeral they had the next day. We'd be washing the hearse, or I even remember inscribing our own nameplate for the caskets. So for me, it really ingrained, and I saw how hard Dad worked and Granddad and how much they really gave to families, and that really impacted on me. But it's not actually what I decided I wanted to do, you know, going through school. And I kind of thought, well, what do I want to do? And I thought I chose what I thought was the best job in the world. And I actually finished high school and became a commercial pilot.
Right.
And I loved it and went on to become a flight instructor. But, you know, this big part of me always wanted to give back to people. And I felt like I wasn't really doing that when I was flying planes. And I always wanted to help people. And so this opportunity came up, and Dad said, you know, do you want to come work for us? We've got an opportunity to design service sheets and film funerals. Would you be interested? And at the time I said, yeah, that's something I know how to do. And it was funny, once I was in there, and after about a month, I went, well, this is where I should have always been.
For sure. And I suppose you did that time between, you know, when you left school and then when you came back to the funeral home. Essentially, you were yearning for something more. You wanted that satisfaction to come back into what your family has always done, you know, through your father and your grandfather.
Yeah, that's so right. And I often think, you know, I could never have done that as a teenager. You know, I needed that experience and that life skills to grow up a little bit, learn who I am, and then come back to join Dad, which is totally different to how you started. And I acknowledge that you did it differently. And why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into it?
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously we've come from totally different backgrounds, and I guess that's what makes this interesting. I guess I was 16, I was at school trying to figure out, what am I going to do with my life? I mean, I played a lot of golf, wanted to be a professional golfer, but knew that there's a fair chance that was not going to happen.
Well, you were never really that good, were you, Bradley?
Wasn't that good. So I suppose it sort of got to a point where I thought, I need to choose what I'm going to do. So I'm sitting there one day and I'm scrolling through a careers book. You know, I'm 16, I'm scrolling through a careers book, and I got no idea what I want to do. I see funeral director. I think, that'd be pretty cool.
And did any of your friends have any interest?
I think I might have been the only person that probably ever went through that school that wanted to be a funeral director, and knew that young. And I guess when I did that, I thought, maybe this is something I can do. I get to wear a suit every day, tie, look flash, So I thought, I'm going to go home and I'm going to tell mum and dad that's what I want to do.
And what did they have to say when you told them?
Oh, they probably thought it was just another phase, Brad's come up with an idea and he thinks he wants to be a funeral director. But, I said, no, I think that's what I want to do. So the curiosity, I guess, got the better of me, and I thought, I need to go and explore this. So went, actually had a distant relative in the funeral industry, and went and approached her, and she, took me on, and I'll be forever grateful, because
And
I
you
don't
were
think I'd be
16 years old.
16
when
years
you,
old
when you started.
and you start at the bottom, right? You wash the cars, you trim the caskets, you do the cleaning, you've a bit of assistant work here and there. But that's what I sort of thought, was important to me. And I got through that. I then moved, my wife decided, she wasn't my wife at the time, but my wife decided that she wanted to move to Australia. So we decided that's what we were going to do.
And they do things pretty differently over there.
They do things differently. A lot less embalming. We spent a lot of time in the city, so, and then into provincial areas, and that was totally different as well in the way they operate. So, yeah, it was definitely an interesting journey for me. And then coming back to New Zealand after those 2 years and buying the funeral home I'm at now, Gateway Funeral Services, when I was 20.
20 years old
20
and you
years
own a
old.
funeral home. That must have been a pretty daunting prospect.
Daunting. I'd never been in management before, so there was a lot of nerves around how am I going to go? How am I going to go managing people? How am I going to go managing a funeral home? It's not just being a funeral director or someone who works in a funeral home. So there was a big change there for me, and I guess that was that maturity. I had to mature up.
Absolutely. And just going back, approaching a funeral home at 16 in itself is, it must have taken a lot for you to do that. And I think for people at home, or those, kind of finishing school, or those that have already finished school and they're thinking about, becoming a funeral director, how would they go about talking to you? Do you want them to come into the funeral home and book a meeting with you? How should they first approach a funeral home if they're interested?
It's interesting because I would entertain the idea, and I'd like the idea of someone coming to the funeral home, seeing me and saying, look, I think I want to be in this industry. And
so do you think they should dress up? Should they go to Hallenstein's and buy a suit?
Buy a brand new suit? What do you think? No, I don't think so. I think they need to come in just smartly dressed. Nice shirt, nice pants, nice shoes. Personal care. You look good.
Should they bring their CV with them? Is that going to be an advantage?
I think it's important for them to bring a CV, maybe even a cover letter explaining why they think they'd be good for the job. And then that there gives them an opportunity to, to explain to the manager or explain to the funeral home owner or whoever's, doing that process that they are interested and genuinely interested.
Right. And so they've had their first meeting. They got to meet you. They've dropped their CV off. They've made a good impression. Should they give you a call back next week, every 2 weeks? Yeah. When should they follow up with you?
I think it depends on the process, doesn't it, Terry? I mean, you get people that come in, maybe if you've advertised for a job. So if you've advertised for a job, they've come in, they've had the interview maybe, and then it's best to leave it. Listen to, they'll be in touch with an outcome. But if you've come in off the street and you're genuinely interested in funeral service and all it has to offer, if there's no job available and they've made that clear, then every couple of months, 2 months, let's say just ring them up or come in and see them.
Not enough to be annoying, but just let them know that
just let them know you're around. And it's all about being keen. It's about being interested. It's about taking an interest in what the funeral home's doing, maybe outside of that as well.
Yeah, of course.
But I think if we go back to the first one, okay, you've got the job, right? You've applied, you've got the job. You've got a job at Terry Longley and Sons. What does that look like in your first 12 months? I mean, you've got the job, you're in the funeral home, it's your first 12 months.
Right, sure.
What does that look like? here at Terry Longley's?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because people often think that that first role is going to be that funeral director or that embalmer role, and so often that's not the case.
Yeah.
And especially through our funeral home, we would look to start someone learning all the basics, learning those foundation of how the funeral home runs.
Right.
And that's through to washing hearses, to trimming a casket, which means dressing it on the inside, putting that side set in, screwing on the handles. That all takes
So
training.
that's something that maybe the general public don't know, is that's a role of someone who works in a funeral home.
Of course, but you're also going to be sitting in on arrangements with funeral directors. You're going to be going to the funerals and seeing how the funeral director works. There's going to be visits to cemeteries, to crematoriums. You're going to actually get to see everything that happens at a funeral home. And I think that 12 months is about a good time frame for that to work.
So you work your first 12 months, right? Your role essentially would be, in the first 12 months, a funeral director's assistant role. You're working around the funeral directors, maybe around the embalmers, around the admin team, really just learning the ropes.
Absolutely, and I think that's important, that you do learn all those skills before we put you in the deep end. You're never going to be on your own with a grieving family, and we'll certainly work your way up to that. And after about 12 months, I would say that you're probably ready to go into some more in-depth training.
Yeah.
And what I'm talking about is probably some qualifications that are out there. And obviously, Brad, that's where you and I met, and it was great to meet you on the funeral director's course. Tell us a bit more about the funeral director's course.
Yeah, there's two different types of education that we can branch off to when you've done your 12 months. So the 12 months is the minimum amount of time that you must spend inside a funeral home before you can go.
So you've already got to be employed before you get on the course.
You've got to be employed. It's not like going to, say, university and doing 4 years of university or however long it may be, and then you go and get the job, right? It's in-house training, and then you go to the course. And the course, essentially, for funeral directors is a year-long diploma, level 5.
Right.
And we do block courses, so 6 weeks worth, so in 2-week blocks. And essentially...
Yeah, what are you learning down there?
That part is more about the, filling in those gaps that maybe hadn't been covered off in your first 12 months, reiterating what you've learned.
So not teaching you how to be a funeral director,
No.
but filling in those gaps.
Definitely, it's learning, as well as, I think the most important part about what I got from the funeral director's course, and hopefully what you got as well, was the networking and the relationships that you built in that course with those students, whether it's me, you, and other students that we had on the course. We built some great relationships.
So you're making friends with other funeral directors around the country. There's also, for me, there was lots of sharing time in classes. It was discussions on how we do things, and what came out for me was how we do things differently. I think that's what I took away from it mostly, is learning how you did things, which is totally different to how we do things, but taking with it, each kind of positive aspect from everybody.
And I guess that the embalming qualification is different again, right? That's the same. It's a level 5 diploma, but they do theirs over 12 weeks of block courses over a year as well.
So once again, you have to already have some embalming knowledge. You have to know how to embalm to get on that course.
You're best not to go to the embalming course if you don't know how to embalm. Same thing with the, as with the university side of things. So you go there, and theirs is a lot more intensive, right? They do, neither of us have done it, but we've had staff do it. So we know what it's like. And they do practical examinations. You've got to do a certain amount of embalmings just to get through the course. So there's a lot of different aspects to that. But the embalming and the funeral directing courses are the qualifications that's required. That's great. But let's address the elephant. Let's address the elephant in the room. And that is, when you come into funeral service, what are you going to be looking at getting paid?
I knew this question was coming, and it's always on people's minds. And we live in a world where the public are pointing the finger at funeral homes, wanting to get the prices low. We want cheaper and cheaper funerals, and funeral homes are businesses. They do have to make money. They do have to make a profit at the end of the year. And so we're caught in this balance of bringing the price of funerals down, but also paying our funeral directors a living wage, and a wage that is in line with the work that they're doing.
Right.
And so starting your first job at a funeral home, so we talk about that funeral director's assistant role, you could be looking to start on, $45,000 to $50,000 would be a pretty reasonable wage, I would say. Of course, once you become that funeral director and you get that qualification, you could be looking anywhere between $60,000 and $75,000, and that's not uncommon for most funeral homes around the country.
But surely those levels of pay, would differ in different areas, right? Provincial to cities.
Certainly the bigger funeral homes with more funerals that they're conducting have more funds there. They've got a bigger staff. They probably can afford to do a little bit more. A long funeral director that's been there for 10 or 20 years, could be as high as $85,000.
Right.
We certainly don't do this job to get rich, do we, Bradley?
No, that's right. It's a satisfaction of providing the service for the family.
Totally.
And being able to be that person that they can trust.
Absolutely. I think it's more about that reward that we get from helping people well and over and above that salary that we receive.
And I mean, this is, we've got to a point where we've discussed some really interesting stuff, and we've just scraped the surface, mate, haven't we? We have. But if you've got any questions that you'd like answered, put them in the live comment section.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because a big part of this podcast that we're doing tonight and that we'll continue to do over the coming months is an interactive podcast. It's about your questions at home, things that you've always wanted to know. We are going to address those shortly, aren't we, Brad? And
for sure.
Have some questions lined up that actually got sent into us last week. So we'd like to address those as well. So, Brad, we've talked about pay, we've talked about getting your first job, but what makes a good funeral director? Are there inherent qualities that we look for when we're hiring?
Yeah, I think there's, when I think about it, I think there's three main qualities that we're looking for when employing a funeral director: care, empathy, and good communication skills.
Right. So essentially, the funeral home can teach you most other things, right?
Yeah. The funeral home can teach you how to transfer a deceased into our care. They can teach you how to be an embalmer. They can teach you how to wash hearses. They can teach you how to, do the administration.
But it's hard to instill that empathy for
It's
for
very
other people.
difficult to teach empathy and teach care and teach good communication.
And are there occupations out there that may already inhibit some of those characteristics?
I think people who come from nursing, people who come from care industries, right? Social work, counsellors, those kinds of people have the qualities of a caring, empathetic, good communicator. And they're people, they're people persons. They're people persons. You know what I mean?
So naturally, they could make pretty good funeral directors.
Yeah, definitely.
But that's not always the case, because much younger people are coming into the industry without that experience, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think those people that are coming in, need good guidance through, maybe their parents, or when they're growing up, or their teachers and things like that. And I think it's important to remember that if those qualities aren't something that you specifically have, I'm not saying you're not empathetic or you're not caring or you don't have good communication, because everyone's got a little bit of that. But it raises another point, and that is that, what if I don't want to be a funeral director? What if I want to be an embalmer, and I only want to be an embalmer? I don't have any interest in funeral directing.
Yeah, and that's something we actually get quite a lot at the funeral home. People showing up, or they give us a call and say, hey, look, I just want to be an embalmer. And we start to wonder, well, where is this coming from? What idea have they got of embalming? Where have they seen this embalming role? And sometimes it's in TV, sometimes it's in movies, it's on Netflix, documentaries. And when we actually break that down, we see, hey, well, maybe what you think embalming isn't necessarily that in reality.
Right. So you find that people come into the funeral home and they maybe just that curious. Maybe it's that curiosity. I wonder what embalming is. Or going further than that is, maybe they think they know what embalming is, or think they know what's involved in embalming, but they actually just need some further education on what that may be.
Totally, and we're happy to sit down with anyone and talk them through the embalming process, how it works. It's actually episode 2 of our podcast,
right,
which we're going to get into next month. But my advice would be that if you want to just be an embalmer, is that be prepared to move to some of the bigger centres, Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch. Some of those funeral homes there are much bigger, and so they can actually afford to have sole embalmers.
Right.
I think when you think about provincial areas, especially like Hawke's Bay, where the funeral homes aren't as busy,
Right.
you're kind of expecting that embalmer role to be mixed in and crossover with the funeral
So
director
you'll
role.
find that the funeral directors in a lot of firms in the provincial areas around, New Zealand would have embalming capabilities.
I think in most places and under most circumstances, yeah, that's right. We talk about funeral directing and embalming as one of the only two roles in the funeral home, but it's not the case, is it? Because there are other roles that we can go into.
Yeah, I think you touched on it earlier with the element of graphic design, right? That's how you sort of came back into the industry when you came back and worked here. Graphic design has become such a evolving, technology as a whole has become such an evolving part of what we do as funeral directors.
So we're talking about graphic design and print media, service sheets.
Yeah, and they can be doing anything from a photo presentation or a photo show at the front of a funeral for someone who maybe hasn't been to a funeral before. Sometimes we have or more and more commonly we're having photo presentations on the big screen at the front of a funeral with tributes of photo tributes from that person's life. They can also be found doing books of remembrance, when someone signs the book when they come into a funeral with their name and maybe a small caption. But the most important part, I think, now that I'm seeing more and more of is the quality of what was the hymn sheet is now the service sheet.
Right. So that's come a long way, and even in the last decade, and especially I've seen it in my time, how far that's advanced. And it's actually becoming more of a beautiful memento and keepsake.
Yeah.
And I think we're putting a lot of emphasis on that take-home.
I mean, you look at when you first started doing the hymn sheets for your father. I mean, they were a white piece of paper folded in half with a photo and a name.
Black and white.
And white, there was nothing to it. Now, it's amazing what can be produced.
Yeah,
and a lot of those things are coming from people with graphic design backgrounds.
Totally. And so there is a key role that, people might not think, but it's still funeral related.
For sure.
Now, Brad, something that I always get asked, and that is, are you confident in standing up and talking at the funeral?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. We get it, obviously, all the time. So, when are we going to talk about what you're going to say? Well, hold on a second. That's not part of the role. And that's where the role of what we call a celebrant or an officiator.
So what is a celebrant?
Yeah.
How does that work?
A celebrant or an officiator is somebody who can be either a minister. You'll find a lot of marriage celebrants working in around the funeral industry. Priests, pastors,
do you need to be licensed to be a funeral celebrant?
No, you don't. You don't. And that's the interesting thing. A lot of marriage celebrants, as I said, are involved in funerals, and they have, they're not, don't have a license, but they have a marriage license, which is for the marriage
so
side of
essentially
things.
Anybody could be a celebrant if they wanted to.
Anybody could be a celebrant, yeah. But the role of the celebrant is, just making a meaningful and creating that ceremony. They do the ceremony. They organise who speaks when, what music's to be played. They're almost like the link between the family and the funeral director sometimes
Sure,
as
so
well.
they lead the family through that service.
For sure. And I guess we've spoken about all the different types of people that fall under the umbrella of organising a funeral, right? You've got your embalmers, you've got your graphic designers, you've got your funeral director's assistants, you've got your celebrants, and there are so many other people that fall under that that umbrella of people that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So, I mean, what people are probably wondering is, what does a day in the life of Terry Longley look like?
Yeah, good question, Brad. And I have to say, look, no 2 days are the same. Every day presents its own challenges, and we're on-call funeral directors. So the phone can ring, and that's what we call the first call. So that is, there's been a death, the family pick up the phone and call the funeral director. And for that family, that is the first time they're connecting with a funeral home. So that's when our job officially starts, and it sets in motion the whole funeral process.
So that could be 1 o'clock in the afternoon, that could be 3 o'clock in the morning.
It can happen any time of the
Right.
day or night, and we've got to be ready. So I guess our day starts when that phone rings.
Right.
And what we call our job is a family's crisis. So what we do is we're heading into a crisis, and we're there essentially to care for that family.
Right.
You know, and if I was to boil down the whole job, it would be to create a meaningful farewell and send off for that family.
And I think that's where people think that sometimes we are just sitting in our office, 3 o'clock in the morning, and we're waiting for the phone call. We're waiting for that call to come in. Whereas actually, we're not. We're at home, we're in bed, probably asleep, and the phone rings, and we're ready to go.
That's right. I've kind of taught myself to wake up and answer the phone in about 3 seconds flat.
Right. And I guess that's comes, you wake up, you put your suit on, you look good, you try and feel good, and you get to the hospital and you help that family in that time of crisis.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, we are heading to these crisis points, but how do you think that affects you personally? So we're constantly dealing with other people's grief.
Yeah.
How's that affected you personally?
Yeah, I think, when you're dealing with families on a one-on-one basis, when I'm saying, you're doing 1, 2, maybe 3 funerals a week, you can dedicate the time that family needs. You can physically dedicate it and say, I have all the time you require to really help you with this. However, when you start getting, if the funeral home starts to get busy and things start to progress and you end up with more than that amount, you run the risk of, a possible burnout or things that don't always go to plan.
Right. So I've done a bit of research on this because it is a very real thing. And you talk of burnout, and there is this thing that we call empathy fatigue. Right. And it is a very real thing, especially with funeral directors. Right. So we're constantly going into situations and we're giving a whole lot of ourselves to these families. And they deserve it. They're the ones in crisis. But if you don't stop to have a look and check your own self, you can find that emotional tank starts to drain pretty quickly.
For sure. And on that note, I mean, you've got, you work in a fairly busy funeral home down here in the Hawke's Bay, and you've recently acquired the coronial contract. Now, for people that don't know, that's involving the police. So anyone that passes away due to, unforeseen circumstances or something, untoward, then the coroner will involve the contracted funeral home, which has been you of recent times.
Yeah, that's right, Brad. And so most of the work that we do in a funeral home is caring for old people that have lived a full life, and the funeral becomes a big celebration of that life. Right. And it's usually a really, really nice thing. Unfortunately, it is a part of life. We do experience these sudden deaths, these traumatic, car accidents and suicides, and those not so nice things. Yeah. And so those deaths are actually referred to the coroner. And their job is to determine exactly how that person died, but make sure the family gets some answers into that death. And so what we do as funeral directors is we assist the police in those first stages. We're called to the scene, and taking on those traumatic cases actually really, really can affect a funeral director.
For sure. And I suppose if you've got sort of 3 or 4 funerals on in a week, and then you're attending, things like that on the roadside even, or in a family home, you're meeting those people, and sometimes the most traumatic time in their life. And you're at the point of where, emotionally, you're almost burnt out.
Yeah, and it's a very real thing. And I've heard of many funeral directors reaching that burnout point because they haven't stopped just to look after themselves. I mean, would you say that your support at home is a big factor when joining the funeral sector?
Yeah, I think from my perspective personally, I think ever since having a family, and I've got a daughter now, my wife has been, really supportive of the fact that, there are times where we're not going to be there. We will get called out over dinner time, or we will be, on a Saturday afternoon at work. Unfortunately, it happens, and it's just about having the right support at home. People, it makes you value family. It makes you value what you have, because, we see it every day. You don't know how long you've got.
So, in a sense, being surrounded by death and dying has given you a unique sense of the beauty of life, or a unique appreciation.
For sure, for sure. And I think, you'll find in your own way, that you've now with the police work and things like that. I guess you'd say that, the support from others or the support from family has to be of the utmost importance.
Absolutely. You've got to have that support network. I think we could go on and talk about that. I think there's so much out there to talk about. We've only scraped the surface. And I wanted this podcast to be a big part of people's questions. And so last week I actually received some questions early. And I had a person kind of message and they were looking for a job. They had bright blue hair. They had piercings, maybe tattoos. Do you think appearances like that play a factor in acquiring a job at a funeral home?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, we're in an industry where people think that, people expect us to look a certain way. We turn up in a suit and tie and we're clean cut, sometimes shaven. I mean, I grow a pretty average beard, but at the end of the day, people expect a certain thing or a certain look when you turn up as a funeral director.
Absolutely.
Now,
so there's this professional kind of...
And I mean, you look at the likes of people on, Air New Zealand or air hostess in general, lawyers, accountants, they are in that professional service industry.
So it's that expectation of what we think we're going to get, but also gaining that trust even before you've even met the family, and that comes down to your appearance. So there's no discrimination there. It's just, I think, what's expected, And today's age, tattoos are becoming more and more accepted, especially with young people in the workplace. But I still think the funeral home and the funeral industry is one of those few places where you can't show up with a face tattoo. So, Brad, if you're thinking of getting that, I probably would advise you against that.
Yeah, maybe I should cancel the booking. Look, I had some other, I had another question come in during the week, and it was around the situation of when someone passes away, at home, for example, or even at the hospital or nursing home or wherever it may be. The funeral director turns up. He then takes mum away. He takes mum, dad, grandma, whoever it may be, away back to the funeral home. And then next thing you know, you come to the funeral home if you're coming to see your loved one and they're in a casket. What's the process between leaving the place of death and the deceased being shown in the casket?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question because it's very rarely spoken about. We show up to the hospital or the rest home. Mum goes back in the car with us, and what happens? And I think, us, I should say. And what we'd do is, if that person passed away during the day, we would bring them back to the funeral home, and under most circumstances, they will actually come into our mortuary facility, and this is where we can actually begin to care for that person, make them look their very best. And that doesn't necessarily mean embalming, although most cases that we do now are embalmed. I think it is our best practice. And, if that person passes away during the night, we don't actually have staff or embalmers on that'll do that work overnight. So they come into what we call our climate-controlled facility. It's essentially a cool room where it keeps that person safe and dignified until we can spend some time with them in the morning. And so that process can happen, as I said, day or night. We've actually got a question in from Mark Peters, and he says, what happens if someone dies at home? Which is a very good question because we talk about the hospitals and the rest homes, but what happens when someone dies at home?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. We have obviously a procedure which happens. So typically, if it's let's say it's an expected passing, right? It's an expected passing. Someone's passed away at home. You would typically ring the funeral director or the doctor first, depending on the hour of the day, right? This is how we would do it. We would advise, ring us, and then if it's, within a respectable hour, we'll ring the doctor and say, look, are you happy to go and see whoever it may be and sign off on that person's passing?
Definitely.
he would send a nurse or someone who can do what, just to sign off and say, we're happy that that person's passed away. Then once that's happened, we would then have, one of our funeral directors or someone come out and transfer the person into our care. So I think
Definitely.
is that sort of how, you would envision that?
Yeah, totally, absolutely. We actually got a question on natural burial.
Yeah,
Have
right.
you heard of that before?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Well, I mean, they ask what is natural burial, and it's something that has come about in the last, couple of years, where people want the most natural form of burial. And what is it? Well, it's actually when we bury someone at a much lower depth in a cemetery. The standard depth is about 1.8 to 2 metres. There's very little soil activity at that depth. And so when we bury someone a lot lower, that's where all the organisms and the enzymes are, which actually break down a casket and a body much quicker. And essentially everything is then returned back into the ground, or back to the earth. And for some people that resonates with them. To do that, we actually have to put a lot of restrictions on that. And most cemeteries do have an area where you can do a natural burial, but they ask that no embalming takes place, so no chemicals are used.
Interesting.
You can't have an MDF casket, which most caskets are now.
So it's got to be made out of solid timber or
So
natural
solid
timber.
natural timber, so no glues or resins. So once you start talking about that, we can't have any synthetics, any synthetic clothing or heavy boots or anything like that. And so when we start putting those restrictions onto family and saying, hey, this is what we have to adhere by, it actually puts a few people off. And to date, we have still yet to do a natural burial in Hastings.
It's interesting. I've just seen a question come through from Adrian Fong. He says here, a majority of funeral directors I see and know are of New Zealand European descent. How sought after are funeral directors from different cultures and ethnicities? Such a good question. Us in Whakatane, where I am at Gateway Funeral Services, we employ, we're in an area which has got a significant Māori population. So we employ Māori funeral directors and embalmers. We have several, actually. And they are really important to the families and the grieving families when that time comes, because they are dealing with someone who they can relate to, who knows their culture,
Definitely.
knows their, how they operate and what the process is going to be for them.
Sure.
So I think that's really important. The next part of that is there's a lot of Māori funeral homes going around in certain areas now, definitely down here as well. There's people who are operating in that,
Definitely.
in that community. There's also up in Auckland, there's so many different, cultures in Auckland now. And so it's really interesting to see the funeral homes popping up there. We've got friends who own Polynesian-based funeral homes, who do island funerals.
Yeah, definitely.
There's an Indian funeral home.
So we've certainly got diversity
There's
in New
diversity.
Zealand, and there's certainly options out there for people with different cultures. I actually got a question, and this is a goodie. Can we make our own casket? And this is something that does come up from time to time. It's no new thing that the DIY Coffin Club has become quite popular in latter years, where people actually get together on a Tuesday afternoon, have a cup of tea and a bicky, talk about death and dying while constructing their own casket. And they get to use that for their funeral. And, we would encourage it. That's a pretty reasonable thing. There are some kind of hidden traps when you provide your own casket. And we have heard of stories where caskets haven't been structurally sound. We don't know where they've come from. Potentially they are untested. So there are some kind of traps in there. Have you had any experience with that?
I've done a lot of work with the coffin clubs locally in Whakatane, Kawerau, and certain places around where we're located. So it's definitely a growing thing for people. The one thing I will say is that I don't have an issue with it at all, because it's personalization, right? You get so many people who make their own casket and they paint it, or in a particular color, they pick pictures on the side of it.
It's a good thing. It's involvement.
Totally.
It's control
totally.
back to the family.
And it comes back to what I said at the start around, giving people control, letting them have control, letting them know what's happening. And if that involves, making your own casket, then sure be it.
Great. Hey, I do have a question in from Louise Tillett, and she asks, what are the rules about having your loved one at home?
Yeah.
Do you have to call a funeral director? And that touches on a point. Do you need a funeral director? Is there a legal requirement to call a funeral director? And actually, Louise, there isn't. And you can keep your loved one at home. In fact, that was one of the oldest traditions in funeral directing, is that you would keep your loved one at home. And the term undertaker is what used to be used. And you'd only call the undertaker to come to the home when you were ready to do the burial. And they would undertake that travel to the cemetery.
For sure.
And so I guess the role has inherently evolved to the funeral director doing more and more. But no, you don't. You can have your loved one at home. You can care for them and wash the body yourself. Again, as funeral directors, a big part of our role is advising families on their decisions.
For sure.
We can provide the options, but we also advise you on some of the consequences. Having no embalming of a body at home does have its own risks. And we can't control what may or may not happen to that body. Odours may arise, discoloration might happen. These are natural things, by the way. These are not scary things.
No.
So be prepared that could happen.
Yeah, and I think that's where, the role of the funeral director comes in, and, they maybe move into, okay, a lot of the time it depends on causes of death too. We're not going to get deep into that, but it depends on causes of death. Sometimes, they've had a really tough time leading up to the passing, and it's just not a good idea to have your loved one at home unembalmed. And so, but if they choose to have that, make that decision themselves, then that's fine. That's their decision at the end of the day. But as funeral directors, our job is to promote the value of embalming and
There's certainly benefits
Yeah.
to that, isn't there?
Definitely.
Hey, when you get to the crematorium, and I get this one all the time, what happens to the casket when someone gets cremated?
Interesting. So what happens is the casket you may see lower, through the
Or a
through
curtain
the floor,
closes.
curtain closes or something like that. So what happens is we take the casket through back into the other side of the crematorium, and what you saw there, at the front of the chapel is what is cremated.
So the casket gets cremated, the handles get cremated, no one's taking those off and reusing them or selling them back to the funeral home.
No, and that is probably one of the most common things we hear. Do you take the handles off, or do you take them out of the casket? Totally untrue. Everything that you saw go through goes into the cremator. And that is the honest truth. That is exactly how it is.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting what people can sometimes come up with and where they get these ideas from. Have you got any more questions on your stream there, Brad?
Not that I can see. Not that I can see right at this stage, Terry.
I do have one. I think we have touched on a bit about embalming, and we'll just do one more. Do we need to embalm? I know we've talked a little bit about that, and we'll talk more in episode 2, but do we need to?
The short answer is no. You don't need to embalm, and people have that option not to embalm. But as we mentioned before about, causes of death and things that, embalming has two, what I class as two basic principles, and that is preservation and presentation. Embalming helps with preserving...
So it's making sure their loved one's going to look their best right up until the funeral.
For sure. And without any, complications. And it restores that natural look, and that's why we promote the, embalming as an aspect of funeral service that we, it can help people through that time.
Absolutely. Hey, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in and asking your questions. This is going to be the first of a few podcasts that we got lined up. We are going to come back next month with a whole session on embalming.
Yeah.
I think it's something that people aren't interested in. We can get more in depth as to what embalming is and
how it happens,
how that works, how that happens. I just want to say thanks, Brad, again for coming down to the Hawke's Bay and joining us on an idea that we've been thinking of for a while. I want to thank everyone for tuning in and know that we're going to keep doing this. We're going to keep answering your questions and keep being transparent.
And you might have questions between now and the next podcast, which will be done next month in November. So we would love to hear them. If you have anything you'd like to ask, even if you might think it's a silly question or a question that may be simple, send us a private message. Send us a message. Terry Longley and Sons Funeral Services on Facebook or Gateway Funeral Services. We're happy to answer any questions that you may have. Hey Terry, just before we finish up, I'd love to say a massive, great big thanks to some of the people that have helped us get this publicised and get understand what we are trying to achieve. So I'd like to thank Katie Shanks from NZME and also Ruby Nika from Stuff for really helping promote, what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think a big part of this podcast was the journey, at least getting to episode 1 and going, hey, we've got this idea. Is anyone actually interested in hearing two funeral directors talk about their job?
Yeah.
And getting that support and people jumping on board early, and it's been really great to see. I just want to do a special thanks to Astrid Austin from Hawke's Bay Today also, who got on board early and believed in what we're doing. I think that's it from us for this episode 1.
That's it.
And again, thank you for joining in, and we will see you again next month.
Thanks a lot.